Welcome to L&D Disrupt, the podcast dedicated to helping you overcome workplace challenges and prepare for the future of work today. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be speaking with the movers, shakers, and path breakers in L&D who are reshaping their organizations right now. Join us each week as we delve into the highs and lows of work in the industry to get to the real nitty-gritty stuff that you actually care about.
For anyone who just joined during those introductions there, this week I'm joined by three brilliant L&D consultants and experts: Tim Lambert from Kay-Lambert Associates, Georgie Cooke from Lima Delta, and Viv Cole from Viv Cole Associates. And the plan for today is that we're hoping to get through 9 of these excellent L&D life hacks. And the format will be that one of our experts will put forward their hack, and then we'll give people, the other two, a couple of moments to share their thoughts and build on it. So it's a bit new for us. Let us know if you like this format. We're going to see how it goes. So the nice thing is actually across the tips that you shared with me ahead of time, there's a couple of themes that make it easier to kind of get into this conversation. But the first one was really about problem diagnosis and building relationships. And Tim, why don't you kick us off with this tip around why the best consultancy is a partnership and why and how we do it?
Yeah, well, I think that it's really important to establish very early on a very solid relationship with any client who you're proposing to work with. That as a consultant, you're not just a hired hand. You're not somebody who's just being brought in to add some extra resource. You're being brought in for your expertise. And in order to be able to offer a solution that is appropriate, you need to really not only understand the client, but care about them. I feel it's a little bit like getting into a really important and involved relationship with the client. And I'm conscious that when I'm working on management development programs with people often say, well, you don't want to get too close. If you're a manager, you don't want to get too close to your staff because that's going to make it difficult when you have to tell them off, for instance. And I always think, well, no, that's actually wrong because, my best friends, my own partner is the one who's the strictest with me. But it comes from a place of love and care and real trust. So I think that you have to really get inside the organization. You need to understand what makes it tick, and you need to care almost as much about the success of that organization as the people who are running the organization do, even though you're still coming in as an independent. And for me, that has really stood me in great stead, that it's enabled us to have very long-term clients, long lasting relationships. So one of the clients I work with today, I've worked with since setting up the business in 2004 and worked with them every single year on a project. And it's because they know I know them and I understand their issues. So that's why I believe partnership is absolutely critical, and don't think of yourself as a hired hand.
Cheers, Tim. Georgie and Viv, to bring in your thoughts, I guess for someone in an L&D team today, they can kind of take those principles and apply them to the different people they work with, the different departments they work with, and ensure there's a good foundation there. So do you have any thoughts to sort of build on what Tim just shared there?
I really agree with Tim there. And I think it's important that relationship is built from both parties. I think the consultant absolutely should be coming in and, as you say, Tim, really making the effort to understand the business much deeper than the surface level project or problem that you might be consulting on. I think a big part of it as well is the role that the client plays. So that client is often an L&D or an HR team. And I think it's really crucial that that party also come into it with that level of openness and a willingness to share information with the consultant, because that's what the consultant really needs in order to do a great job. They really need access to the right people, the right stakeholders. They want to be able to talk to learners, gather data, and all of that helps inform the solution. So I think there's a real need for the consultant to be curious, and there's a real need for the client to be open. And when both parties do that, I think that's when you build that level of relationship you were talking about there, Tim. And that's kind of where the magic happens, I reckon.
Yeah.
It's relationships, not transactions. Most of the worst projects that I can think of ever working on agency side are when clients have just regarded it as a transaction. and the best ones are where we've really taken time to invest in the relationship and solved something meaningful.
Yeah, and I think all those principles do really apply to what an L&D team can do internally. Like if you're going to a different department, you have to understand what the relationship is with them. Are you building something for the long term? Do you really understand their needs and how you're going to solve them? So I really like that. And it leads us nicely, Georgie, into your advice that would be around getting the timing right and finding the right problems to solve. Now, this applies, I guess, if you're a consultant or if you're in-house in L&D and go into other departments of the business. So, tell us a bit about that.
Yes, this does lead on really nicely, actually, from what Tim was saying about partnership. And I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that in order for, as I say, that magic to happen where the consultant is curious and the client is open, the client needs to, I guess, be clear on what they're trying to get out of this, what their motivations are. And I think everyone on the client's team needs to be bought into that vision in order for them to want to be open and share with the consultant. So, for example, I've had projects where on the client side, there's one person who's like really desperate to create this change and is really trying to push it through. And I really admire that in that person. But it can be very challenging if they don't have buy-in from everybody else, because the consultant's likely to come in and say, oh, great, could I talk? Actually, it sounds like the marketing team are really involved in that. Can I see what they're doing? Or I'd love to run a focus group. Can we get access to a small group of learners to speak to? And if that one person doesn't have buy-in, if there isn't a shared vision amongst everyone in that client team, there can be lots of barriers put in place there that can make the project quite difficult. But on the flip side, if the client's kind of done that piece of work beforehand, so for example, if you as the L&D team have already got buy-in from all the key stakeholders, you're all agreed on the problem you're trying to solve and you all want to solve it, that means you're able to come to those conversations and able to express that vision and provide the consultant with the access they need. Actually, I've just noticed on the call, a lovely client that I worked with last year is on here, and that was a banking client, a great example of that, where a lot of work on the vision and the why had been done first, and there was therefore a stakeholder group that were really able to support the project, and it went very smoothly as a result. So I think that upfront work by the L&D team is really important.
Yeah. Just before we bring in Tim and Viv, just a slight follow-up question, but it links back to that relationship part, but how sometimes people come to you with that shared vision or that problem and they maybe don't have the full understanding of the problem. So how do you kind of keep that relationship and still push back to diagnose the real problem to solve?
That's a really good observation. Often there might be a surface level problem that presents itself. And actually when you dig into it, there might be something bigger underneath it. But I think as long as there is a shared desire to solve whatever that surface level problem is, then it's good news if you find the thing underneath it that's really causing it. So I think as long as everybody can remain focused on what you're trying to achieve and the main problem you're trying to solve and be open to, we don't yet know why that is. We don't know that's the journey we're going on. And if everyone agrees on that and is open to where kind of the data and the discovery takes you, then whatever you discover is good news because it's all a step towards figuring it out and getting a solution.
Yeah. Viv, what are your thoughts on this? And then we'll go to Tim as well.
Violent agreement. Very, very, very much a situation where the more that the L&D team has a unified vision of what they want, the better. In real life, often there is a bit of tension between different stakeholders as to what they want or how they want it. That probably leads into what I was going to say next. So I'll just pause at this point and let Tim chip in.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Georgie. Absolutely. I concur with all of that. I think one of the things that you need to clarify when you're dealing with L&D professionals is just to make sure there are no hidden agendas. that you are actually genuinely uncovering a true desire, and you haven't got rogue individuals who are going off trying to force something through without necessarily being transparent about what it is. As a consultant, you can sometimes fall into the trap of being brought in to do, some dirty work, because then everybody else can wash their hands of it. And so you really do want to make sure. And again, if you've got that trusting relationship, then that's likely to be avoided. And the other thing is you referred a number of times to the L&D team, whereas a lot of the work I do is with maybe an L&D business partner. So they don't see themselves necessarily as part of the organizational team. And when you're dealing with small interventions like that, I think it's really important to try and understand what already exists in the wider organization, and are we trying to do something that's already been done before or already exists and is successful in another part of the organization? And also, what we do here, is there any way that we could integrate that more broadly across the organization so that they're getting extra value from that one intervention? Yeah, no,
that's a great point. And just an open question, if anyone has any thoughts on this, but have you got any tips on how you navigate any of that tension when, you do need to push a little bit further to diagnose a problem, or you do need to dig a bit deeper to say what's been done before, what hasn't worked? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think for me, it's pretty much all around how you ask each of those stakeholders to articulate what success looks like. And some of that is understanding what success looks like in terms of whether it's sort of business metrics, sales, calls, referrals to help desks, or whether it's actually more qualitative factors like the need for innovation, or bottom line, it's often how is this going to make them look good in the eyes of their boss or their boss's boss. And I think, coming back to a question that sort of Kurt's raised in the chat, it's how do you navigate that tension? Often, once you have that sense of what success looks like, one thing which can unify that vision is to actually look at it through the perspective of your learner or your user, because ultimately what you're creating needs to be adopted and be transformational for your learners. So much of it actually comes down to you as a consultant championing the view of the learner. And I think ultimately what you're trying to get to, clear goals, clear measures. So it's not about here's some content, let's make it more beautiful. It's here's something where we give people an experience, we have learning transfer, we have behavior change.
Yeah. I mean, that was sort of the next hack we were going to get to. So it'd be cool to bring in Georgie and Tim to hear their thoughts. But I guess one thing you made me think about there is it a case of mixing two things together? Like the metrics are probably the things that matter to the senior people that you need to get buy-in from. But as you mentioned there, if you think about the end learner, maybe it needs to be something more aspirational, or like not necessarily tied to numbers, but it can be a bit more anecdotal, like do you feel more confident in your role versus like, do you have X skill, or have you managed to close X more deals? But like, how much did you enjoy doing that? Do you think there's a mix there? Do you see that for L&D teams?
I
completely
certainly do. Yeah.
Go, Tim.
Okay, absolutely. I mean, I think the holy grail of learning and development is how do you quantify return on investment? It's just one of those things that we're constantly coming up against. How do you justify the expenditure here? Because it's almost what you're saying is, well, if we don't spend the money, this is what you're going to get, and that's terrible, isn't it? But absolutely. For the financiers, they need to see that there is some real financial gains in terms of productivity uplift, etc. But for the individuals, that's not necessarily what's going to float their boat. This is about how do we excite them and incite them to change and develop and achieve their potential and take it wherever they want to go.
Yeah, and Georgie, for yourself, do you see that kind of mix of getting business leaders to maybe buy into the metrics, but really having to connect with people on an individual level, make it aspirational?
Absolutely. And this is actually leads in pretty nicely into what my next tip was going to be, which is that audience is everything. Everything. I think it underpins all the work we do. And I think your question there, Gary, sums that up perfectly. The stakeholders in the business are likely to have their success criteria, and that's really important for the consultant to hold. But that doesn't mean that that's the success criteria that should be communicated to the learners. So we've got a thing, as a consultant, you've got two parties that you are in service of. You're in service of the business that is paying you and delivering for them, but you are equally, if not more, in service to the learners, because actually, if you don't design everything for the learners, the behavior change won't happen, and then the business won't get the results thereafter. It's a loop. So I think absolutely the business might be focused on bottom line. So let's take an example. Let's say it's you want to help the sales team close more deals. Let's use that as an example. The business is likely to be really focused on the bottom line. That's their driver. That's why they're doing it. But for the sales team, maybe for them, the motivation is like, do you want more commission next month? Or do you want to be top of the rankings? So for the learner, it's about knowing them well enough to be able to know what is aspirational for them, what's likely to grab their attention, what's going to motivate them, so that you are confident that you'll motivate them enough to take the action they need to take to change their behavior, which then creates the result that the business is looking for. Yeah. So I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of being so guided by the business's success criteria that you kind of forget about the audience and how you make that resonate with them. It's a lesson that I've learned before. It's a lesson that I'm sure I'll keep learning on projects every now and then. But I would say that's what I mean by my tip. Audience is everything and needs to come underneath. Yeah, needs to be what drives everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've got a good mix of like L&D consultants and people in L&D teams here. And I think the same thing applies to both scenarios. You might go into a particular department. Let's continue with the sales example. And you'll be dealing directly with maybe the manager or the head of the sales team. But then actually, for learning to happen, you need to engage all the sales reps and the SDRs and the account executives. We call it the engagement gap at How Now, but it's essentially the idea that without engagement, nothing else that you expect to happen afterwards will happen, because that is the first requirement for any learning to happen. It has to be that people are engaged. And it ties back to a couple of the things we talked about here, diagnosing the problem, really getting people to see, articulate what success looks like, and then tap into that. You mentioned other motivations there, like whether it's salary, progression, even just a positive like feeling in your role every day. So I really like that sort of tip, and I'd love to hear. Tim, maybe have you got any sort of thoughts on that as well, around the audience being everything?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Learner focus. You've got to go into that relationship, understanding what the learner wants to get out of it and why they're there and what's going to keep them there and keep them interested and support them, because otherwise the client won't get what they want anyway. So our education system up to 16 and 18 isn't really learner focused. It's very much tutor focused. It assumes that people are empty vessels, and we go and we pour our wisdom into them, and that they're going to sit there and lap it up and be able to regurgitate it. And that is not what we want to do as consultants or as facilitators or trainers. We have to start with where the learner is and what the learner wants, and coax them and coach them and reassure them and support them through that process, because ultimately they are the people who are going to go out into the world and do it and enact this. We're not. And I had a bad experience when I was a freelance facilitator. I was called upon to run a program for a police force that I won't mention, and it was a very, very prescriptive course, down to exact timings of how long you spend and exactly what you have to say. It was almost like learning a script, and basically a huge sheep dip approach of taking this police force through this program without any interest in them and why they're there and what their lived experience was, and it was an absolute disaster, and I vowed never to do it again. So I learned the hard way. But learner focus, absolutely number one tip.
Nice. Viv, this is flowing so nicely that leads us into your next tip, which was about context being everything as well, or context being king. I think if we think back to what Tim and Georgie has just spoken about there, if we think learner first, we have to consider what is that person trying to achieve in the moment where learning takes place? What is the environment like? Are they on a call? Are they busy? Do they have an hour to sit down and look at something? Are they maybe in retail on a shop floor? There's all these different variables when it comes to context that not only determine whether someone will be engaged in learning, but whether it'll be effective. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this, sort of how important context is.
And I think I did a contract with a large pharmaceutical company where I actually invested a day going around with a sales rep, which was great fun in terms of driving around the south of England, meeting lots of doctors, trying to bribe them with sandwiches and all the rest of what is day to day in the life of a pharmaceutical sales rep. And that was just time so brilliantly well spent in terms of understanding who my target learners were, what their motivations were, what their day actually looks like. So as a L&D team, I would thoroughly encourage you to go and do that yourself in terms of shadow people where you can. And then when you're engaging consultants, also consider that as part of the discovery phase of the work. So it just gives you this real sense of, okay, what's the day look like? And then in terms of context, understanding where the learning intervention is going to land. So thinking of the experience in terms of what happens before, during, and after, because it's not a vaccination. What you're designing is part of a process or a campaign of a transformation. And I think in a world where ChatGPT, there I've said it, it's, you can't go through a webinar sort of in the month of April without saying ChatGPT. In that world where content is just really fast and easy, what's actually most crucial as the value add is understanding the context. So what's relevant to somebody? How will something land? How will you get somebody excited and motivated?
Yeah.
And it's kind of really the last sort of two hacks are possibly two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
It's know the audience, but also be really super focused on understanding the context.
Yeah, just before we bring in Georgie and Tim, a follow-up question on that, of that spending a day with the sales rep. I guess it links back to what we said earlier, that sometimes people come to you with a problem that's actually a symptom of something else. And have you found in your experience actually spending that time looking at where someone is encountering problems and seeing it helps you diagnose the problem better, rather than someone coming to you and saying, like I'm not having a good response rate on my customer support request, for example, and you spend a day with the customer support rep and you find out that actually they don't have any consistent answers to common questions, for example. And then having seen that, then you really actually understand what the problem is. So how has that helped you kind of diagnosing problems, to come back to an earlier hack?
Yeah, massively. And I mean, often learning gets brought in to patch up a process which isn't particularly working well, or a bit of software which is horribly difficult to use. And so the real solution would be make the process easier or make the software better. But in the time and the budget that you've got available, it's recognizing where those problems are and giving your learner the chance to work around that.
Cool. Georgie, maybe to bring you in now on the whole topic of context and understanding what's happening when someone is trying to learn, and what are your experiences with that?
Yeah, there's something I'd like to say here, and I'd also love to pick up on Richard's question from the chat about how do we actually get clients to create the time and the budget for this important phase. Just one thing on understanding context and audience, really picking up on Viv's point about spending time with the learners. Something that I often have a little chuckle to myself about in my head is lots of people say, for example, lots of senior people in organizations, stakeholders, sitting around a boardroom table drawing up learner personas. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a learner persona, and a learner persona can be a super useful thing to have written down to come back to. But it does always make me chuckle when the people creating the learner personas are not the learners, or are not people who have spent time with the learners. And I think we have to acknowledge that often there's a really big gap between the group of people working on the project and the actual audience it's for. So, for example, to go back to our sales rep example, a learning team and an HR team, members from that team that are forming this project team are a million miles away from a person who's driving around between different doctors, giving them sandwiches and telling them about the new drugs that are coming down the line. Or if you're designing content for a customer support team, perhaps, or a manager, but you don't actually work in that environment, then you just by default don't have an understanding of that context. So I think a hack for consultants and L&D teams is to build your personas with the learners, talk to them, spend time with them, and then capture what they're telling you about their context and their needs in a persona that you can then refer back to again and again and again. Yeah. So I think that's a good tip as a kind of like how to. And to Richard's question about how do we get people to create, how do we get the client to spend money on that upfront phase? It is sometimes tricky. And to Kurt's earlier question, have you ever walked away from projects? Sometimes the projects that we choose to walk away from are the ones where it's very clear, even from proposal stage, that the client's not interested in doing any of that work. But I think what I tend to do now is say that that's a phase that I think is really important and that we need to include. And if there's pushback on it, I just tend to explain if we don't do it, the impact that that's likely to have on the project. So, for example, if we don't do this phase and we don't spend a bit of time with learners, we're not going to understand them as well. Our solution is likely to not be as impactful or successful, and that's likely to impact X success criteria that you've said you're after. Are you still comfortable with that decision? Because I think sometimes people are just looking to move quickly, as we all are. We want to get solutions out there fast. And sometimes they may just not realize what they're passing up on or the impact it might have. So I think just really helping everybody understand that, from a place of, I want the best for you and your audience and your success, which is true. I think coming at it that way and just explaining what the compromises that they're making can be a useful way of getting them to commit to it.
Yeah, it's that avoiding that temptation to view output as impact, isn't it? Like, it's not how quickly can we create something, how well can we understand a problem. And I guess as well, just to come back to learner personas, often I find that with marketing personas anyway, is over time people then just use that as a shortcut to stop understanding problems. So is there any sort of advice for how often you should either update learner personas or actually sit down and say, this is outside the learner persona? So for example, like we might say this is our ideal customer profile, and we come to one project and it doesn't fit into any of the profiles. So the idea is that we don't shoehorn like the content into X persona from a marketing perspective. It would be, we have a different audience here and we need to tailor it for that. Have you seen that in translating into learning?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess it's trying to get that mindset of the personas being a living document, not I did it once 2 years ago, this is now our learner persona, especially because right now businesses are going through so much change all the time, constantly, that even a persona that you made 6 months ago, the company may have restructured since then. There may be new goals. Things are changing so fast that I think it's trying to see personas as living things that you continue to build on, rather than something that's ever complete.
Yeah. That's the perfect segue to bring in Tim, to kind of get your thoughts on what we just shared there, but also the sixth hack is around trying to avoid the cut and paste approach. And I think this speaks to that. So maybe tell us your thoughts on this previous point, and then also share your insights on avoiding that cut and paste approach.
Thank you. Well, great discussion, by the way. Really, really really informative and inspiring. And I'm thinking that what we have to do as consultants, or anyone operating in the L&D space, is that we have to take advantage of our independence. Because when you're so close to a situation, you can very easily jump to a conclusion or base your conclusion on historical data that has subsequently shifted. And yet, as a consultant, when you come into a situation, you can come in with fresh eyes and a fresh perspective. So you're not saying to the existing organization or the client that, you know, we don't believe you. We don't believe what you're telling us in terms of your analysis. What we're saying is we have the advantage of coming in. We haven't got any of the baggage. We haven't got any of the sort of political constraints or any of the historical data. We can come and have a look at the situation with a fresh pair of eyes. And I think that that's really useful. And I also think that if you're engaging with the learners as a consultant at the very earliest diagnostic stage, what you subsequently deliver to them is going to land so much better. You've already established a relationship with the learners, and the learners feel that they've been listened to. So they're probably going to be much more receptive to whatever solution you propose. So yes, related very much to my life hack about don't cut and paste. There are occasions where people will contact me and they say, you know, we've got a problem and we need some assertiveness training. And the easy solution would be to say, oh, well, we've got an assertiveness course. It's all ready to go. So we'll come in and we'll deliver that. And of course, that might not be exactly what they need at all. And it may not be anything to do with assertiveness. It might be to do with the fact that you've got a bit of a bullying culture. So there's all sorts of things that are going on in the organization. And I think that we need to do what I call diagnosis before prescription. So we do need to go through a process of really trying to understand. I mean, what is it Covey says? Seek first to understand, and really make sure that whatever solution that you're providing is pertinent to the real underlying issues that the organization's facing. To do that, I might typically use just a standard coaching approach. If you're familiar with the coaching model of setting your goals, understanding what your goals are, checking the reality, looking at options, and how you're going to move forward. So the GROW model, the coaching model, is a way of really trying to ascertain and understand exactly what is going on in this organization. What are you trying to achieve? How could we approach it? And then come back with some proposals, rather than saying, yeah, I've got this one ready to go. That seems to fit. We'll tap that on.
Yeah. There's two things there, Tim, I just wanted to follow up on. One, I guess this links back to your first point about building relationships for the long term. And two, it links back to how L&D teams can build relationships for the long term. Because I know a lot of L&D teams, maybe there's a temptation to be that approval center where people come to you and say, we need X. And you can say, okay, the easy option is to just say yes. But in both scenarios, in the long term, doing the easy route the first time means there's possibly not going to be another time. Because if you just give them the pre-described assertiveness training, well, it won't solve the problem, and therefore they won't see you as adding value in the long term. And the same thing applies if you're an L&D team in a company and sales come to you and say, we need more training, and you just send them a course. If it doesn't have any impact, then the long-term relationship and your ability to drive change in the long term suffers as a result. Is that something you would agree with?
Absolutely, yes. You have reputational loss, don't you? Because it didn't do what it said on the tin. It didn't have the desired effect. So there's no point in doing that. It might seem expedient. It means that you're going to hit your monthly figures, but it's not actually going to bring repeat business. And for us, it's all about having those longer term relationships with our clients.
Cool. Just before we bring in Viv and then Georgie, a reminder that if you do have any questions, drop them in the chat, because we're doing far better for time than I anticipated. I've checked my stopwatch and we're doing pretty well. So reminder, you can drop them in the chat. Viv, before we get to Georgie on this cut and paste approach, how do you see this? How do you avoid doing that? How can L&D teams and businesses avoid just replicating what they've done before?
I think part of it as a L&D team is being really clear about what's the strategic value that you're trying to add to your business. And the reality for most L&D teams in large organizations now is that for the top 20% most strategic needs that come into your ticketing system or across your desk, you're going to come up with something bespoke, with good discovery, with significant stakeholder buy-in. You will actually really do that properly. For the long tail of one-off requests, you're going to hope that people find relevant content in your learning experience platform and don't bother you too often, and that perhaps your metrics from the LXP say, oh, we've got a ton of people who are interested in project management. Let's actually go and check out what's going on in the business, which is suggesting that there is a need around this. And when we were talking about sort of cut and paste, there is that sense of third-party learning content on your learning experience platform is effectively the same content being copied and pasted each time. So it's key to give it the context by curating it, but also recognizing that there is a trade-off between we can't personalize absolutely every piece of learning, but we can do a really great job on the learning that's strategically important.
Yeah, exactly. I'll drop a link in the chat, but we've got a great resource that people might find useful about the ICE framework. So how you can prioritize the things that will have impact by creating a score that essentially combines impact, confidence, and ease. And then that numerical value allows you to work out how likely someone is to succeed, the effort it will take. So I'll drop that in the chat now. And Georgie, what are your thoughts on this
Thank you.
cut and paste approach and what Viv and Tim both just shared?
I agree with both Viv and Tim. I think the point I'd add is I think there is always a balance between you do want to learn from what has worked well before, but that doesn't mean you want to just replicate it exactly. So I actually do always ask my clients what has gone down well with this audience before, the pieces that they've responded well to, that they've rated highly, or that you have seen behavior change as a result of. I do want to know what those things are, but that's not because I want to copy them. It's because I want to dig into what was it about that worked? What was the thing that really landed? Maybe it was, how we grabbed attention. Maybe it was the thread running through how we were talking to those people. Maybe the tone was spot on. And those things I do want to learn from and use. But I don't want to just copy and paste what the previous approach was, because just because it worked well once doesn't mean it will necessarily work well again. But we do want to make sure we're learning the good lessons. So I would say it's not necessarily saying don't cut and paste anything. It's saying be really discerning about what the good bits are that are worth reusing and which bits you need to think through again.
Yeah, it's about understanding the principles that work, not the tactics. I think that's a lot of the time people do that correlation causation thing. Like we rolled out this initiative and it worked, but it wasn't necessarily the format, for example. It'll be the principles underpinning that. Like you said, were we speaking to our audience? Have we understood the problem effectively? Were there some commonalities across that? So
that's a much more succinct way of saying it, exactly what I meant, Gary. Thank you.
Well, I stole that from someone else, so that's why.
Great. Love that. Sharing is caring.
Yeah, exactly. Before we get into sort of the final three tips, there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'd like to get to. One, I'll maybe give you some time to think about and we'll come back to at the end. But if there's any sort of big mistakes or quote unquote failures that you've learned from, but we'll come back to that. So I'm not springing that on you. But the next one is from Gemma, and it's about after you've done in the first steps after you take that discovery phase, have you determined the sort of format and training that suits people? And do you have like a period of testing with the end user? So open question to anyone who wants to sort of share anything on that.
I'm a big fan of running pilot schemes, especially if the learning is likely to be rolled out more broadly across an organization. So I'm currently working with a client exactly on that, where we're taking a small group of people drawn from different manufacturing sites who are coming together to be a test group. And then we can get a lot of good feedback from that and we can modify. And that's very much a model that I've used with other clients in the past. And that's been successful. It doesn't guarantee that just because it worked really well for that particular cohort, it will automatically work well for everybody else, which is why I think anybody in consultancy needs to be nimble and, quick on their feet and intuitive and receptive to what's actually going on in the room. And have some flexibility to be able to modify and respond to individual learners within the session. But I think it's a really useful way to run a short pilot and analysis.
Cool. I think that nicely covers the second part of the question. So Georgie and Viv, in terms of once you've done the discovery phase, how do you kind of scope out what the best format or the best structure is for sort of the content that will work, or the kind of the strategy?
For me, often the output at the end of a discovery phase is that recommended solution. So that does come as part of that phase, but it's there for validation with some end users and the stakeholders as well. So I guess my process tends to be do your research, figure out from the research the principles that are going to underpin your design. So at Lima Delta, we use a lot of behavioral insights as our principles, thinking about how do we really tap into the psychology of our specific audience. So often we kind of go from research to principles and insights, and then shape a recommended solution off the back of that, ideally for testing. I completely agree with Tim that in an ideal world, there would be a really nice pilot phase with a good sample size of users. The reality, I would say, is that that's not the case in, I would say, probably over 50% of projects. The client timelines mean that there just isn't space for a month-long. A real pilot you would deliver all the training and you would wait for 6 months to see if the behavior changed as a result. The vast majority of clients have not accounted for that. Mm-hmm. So if that isn't possible, then my backup I go to is to say, right, even if when we're reviewing this concept that I've proposed, I want some of those reviewers to be users. I want them to be looking at that and saying, oh yeah, I can imagine from these mock-ups how this would work. Yes, I think this would land. No, I don't think this would land. I don't really understand what you're getting at here. So even if you don't have the time or the budget for a full pilot, I would still say do what you can to get learner input super early.
Yeah. Cool. Viv, any thoughts before we move into those last 3 tips?
Yeah. What this sort of has reminded me of quite a lot is a sort of a classic approach to sort of blended learning in general, but the idea that you need to think through what's the nature of the learning that you're trying to communicate, who are the learners, what are they like, any sort of constraints in terms of logistics, budget, and similar. And from that, I tend to find that I can narrow down pretty quickly into what is actually the method or the way in which somebody is going to learn. And then when I've got that sense of how people are actually going to learn, that informs the media choices, which I think sort of picks up a bit on Paulina's question. So I think from the discovery phase, in my head, I will have sort of almost checklisted against the jukebox model and a few others. Where are we at? And then my other top tip is sleep. Having as many sleeps as possible after you've done the discovery phase until you're actually coming out with the design will give you a better chance of coming up with different ideas or ways of doing something, which give you some options, and then pilot them with a real life audience if you can.
Perfect. If you're listening to the recording of this, Viv shared a great resource in the chat about this jukebox model that I'll put in the show notes. So just check the description for that link. I think we'll go quick fire for this last 12 minutes because there's another question or two we want to get to. So what we'll do is we'll go through these last sort of tips without building on any of them, and then we'll come to those questions at the end. So Tim, over to you. Tell us about how we can deliver sustainable change or change that sticks.
Okay, so I think that our approach to learning and development, we need to apply the same criteria as to any change management program, because learning is change management. There's no point just feeding people with information and knowledge if that's not actually going to drive change in attitudes or behaviors. And I've worked on lean implementation programs in manufacturing sites where the lean implementation has failed because they basically adopted a project management approach. They saw it as a set of tools that need to be put into the organization without ever considering we're talking really about a mindset and behavioral change here. And that's fundamentally what was required. I often say that, you manage tasks and projects, but you lead people, and it's a leadership, it's a change leadership approach that I think we need to adopt when we're talking about learning and development.
Perfect. Nice and succinct. Georgie, moving on to yourself, this tip around collaboration and maybe L&D leveraging outside perspectives or outside skill sets. I know, again, this is something that applies to kind of consultancy, and also if you're an L&D team internally, there's a wealth of other skills and people and fresh eyes and skills at your disposal. So tell us about this collaboration hack.
Yeah, what I was getting at here is that the internal staff in an organization and any outside expertise they bring in, so consultants, for example, have very different perspectives. There can be a temptation to try and meet in the middle on everything, but I think really both parties need to really value each other's perspectives. The consultant's outside view is too outside if it's not balanced with the experience of what it's really like inside the organization. And if people inside the organization are trying to do everything on their own, I think they are too in it to be able to think differently. So what I was getting at here is that there's likely to be tension, there's likely to be disagreements. I think rather than always trying to compromise and meet in the middle, everyone be open to giving the other party's way a try, actually giving it a go. Be brave, try and make bigger changes, and consider them tests. When doing something on one project doesn't mean you're doing it that way forever. It means you're being brave, you're testing something new, and you're learning from it. Everything is data acquisition for the next projects. So being able to bring those perspectives together and collaborate rather than feeling defensive about the other person's view, I think on both parties leads to a great solution.
Yeah, I think just a quick follow-up, it kind of links to that sort of fail fast, learn fast thing. Like the quicker you test, like the minimum viable proposition, the sooner you learn whether or not it works. And I think managing that expectation that testing doesn't always need to be that 3 or 6 months. It can be like, what's the quickest way we can build this out and see if it actually works, whether it's just a Google Doc that goes out to people. Does it help us get closer to the goal? If yes, let's do it. If not, pivot. So yeah, I really like that tip.
Yeah.
Viv, over to you, last but by no means least. We've spoken about a few times before about this idea of asking why, and why we need to not be shy to keep saying why, but also we can keep asking ourselves internally the why a lot of the time. So give us this final hack on asking why.
So I think you can always ask why. Spend any time with a 4-year-old and you'll be surprised how many times the why question can be used in everyday life. But in your world, there's a trade-off between finding useful information and the credibility that you have with stakeholders. Because if you ask somebody why in the wrong way, and they'll say, "Oh, but I told you that already," and you get nowhere. So as somebody working in-house in L&D, I would encourage you to ask your stakeholders, why are we doing this? Or why is that important? Or why is that a goal for you? Why is this a good metric? As much as you dare, tell your friendly consultant who you've partnered with what you've found out so far, and then give them the opportunity to ask why loads of times as well. And when you as the L&D person or you as the consultant has reached the point where you think, okay, it's not really credible for me to keep on asking why, ask it silently in your head and have these hypotheses or all these questions that are going through your thinking, because there may be times in a conversation that you can find out what you need to know indirectly without your stakeholder even realizing.
Yeah, agree. I think sometimes you can ask that why about things as well. So, for example, why are we still using X platform or X piece of software, right? Or why are we still spending 20 hours a week on this thing? Like, you don't always need to ask why to a person. Actually, you can do a deep dive into the usage data. Like, why are we still using a course library, for example, if only 10% of our people are logging in and using any of the courses? So you can kind of often use that why mindset to get data that then supports. You don't even need to go and ask why to someone. You need to tell them why something doesn't work sometimes. And if you can use that internal why, I think you give yourself a good chance of success.
Could I just come in on there and say that absolutely, asking why is a brilliant way of probing and interrogating and understanding and getting to root cause. How you ask why is really important, because if it's done in an interrogative way, people can get onto the back foot and feel that they're being criticized and they have to justify, and then you might not get the right analysis. So, just a simple example, if you, instead of saying, why did you do that? If you ask, what were you hoping to gain by doing that, then you're probably going to get a slightly different response. So I do agree that the why is important, but I think we just need to be mindful of how people might respond to a why. And if there is an alternative, we might get a better response.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I just wanted to say, you mentioned earlier on, Tim, the GROW coaching model. And I remember when I trained as a coach using GROW, one of the first things they said was try and turn why into what or how questions. So in my head as the consultant, the question is definitely why, but I might ask it as you said, what are the benefits you're seeing from this? Or what hasn't met your expectations? The framing is less likely to make people feel defensive. But in my head, to your point, Viv, it's always, but why?
Yeah,
I like that reframing point. I think it ties back to what we spoke about at the very start, which is diagnosing a problem. Because if you can frame it as how did that get us closer to the goal or the metric we set as success at the start, and that is probably less confrontational. So yeah, great tips on the framing. I did say we'd come back to it, and the question from Kurt around if there were any sort of mistakes or failures, things that didn't go to plan, however we want to frame it, and if anything you learned from that.
Kurt's coming in with a big hit of questions. I love it. I'm happy to answer this one. I think for me, the last tip that I gave about not always seeking to compromise and meet in the middle, that tip is definitely born out of my own learnings and mistakes that I've made in the past. I think particularly earlier on in my consulting career, I think I was really concerned about making sure that the stakeholders were happy. And sometimes I would compromise on what deep down I knew was the best option in order to maintain, as Viv was saying, that feeling of credibility and being in control of the project. And I learned pretty quickly that I might have felt like I had more credibility in the moment, but actually if the solution ends up being not as powerful, you have less of it in the long run. So I would say that's a big learning I've had that now massively informs how I work.
Cool. Thanks, Georgie. I'm really conscious of time, actually. We've got a few minutes left. So maybe Tim and Viv, I'll give you the floor to just elaborate a little bit on Paulina's question that we got to earlier. Yeah. But it's more about the balance between face-to-face and online now that we've got more people working remotely. There's more tools to help us work sort of synchronously or asynchronously. So any final thoughts on that balance with face-to-face and online?
It's here. The genie's out the bottle, and we have to respond. We spoke about context, didn't we? We have to take account of the way people work now and the way people live their lives. We want, to reference your ICE model that you mentioned. We want to make learning easy for people. We want to make it accessible for people. So we have to consider a fully blended approach, which will include, for the foreseeable future, using virtual technologies, using online programs, using webinars like this, as well as face-to-face. But I think that what we can't do is assume that you can just take something that was delivered in a face-to-face forum and just do it online, because it's a different experience. I do a lot of work with groups on role play, for instance. Trying to do role play online, you don't get in any way, shape, or form the same sort of response or benefits. So you have to match the content, whatever it is you're trying to do, and the learning outcomes to the medium through which you're delivering it.
Yeah, true. I think we discussed a lot of this already, but context and not doing the cut and paste approach. So I suppose that's the two mindsets to apply. Viv, any sort of final thoughts to add on that? Maybe 30 seconds or so to go.
Yeah, I don't think there is an optimum balance. I think it depends. So do the discovery work, think creatively, bounce ideas off people, test them out with real people.
Oh, perfect. That brings us nicely to time. You'll get a survey from Lima if you joined us live, and it'd be great if you can share some insights on whether you like this format, if there's anything you'd like us to, if we did it again, would you like to see us do differently? A reminder that if you're listening to this or you're attending live, you'll get an email with links to where you can find Tim, Georgie, and Viv, and connect with them. And I suppose that's it really, other than thank you to all three of you for joining me today.